Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our program. We are going to be recording today's event, so if you are uncomfortable being on camera, feel free to disable your camera at the start of the event. I am going to throw it over to our host, Nancy Kraus, in just a moment, and we'll be going over a number of different book titles. You will be receiving an email after the event with all of the books listed. And we will be keeping the room on mute until the Q&A portion in about 40 minutes. Do feel free to drop questions in the Zoom group chat along the way so we can collect those all for the end of the event. Thank you so much, and here is Nancy.
Hi, it's great that you're all here and interested in this important topic. I am Nancy Kraus. I am a children's librarian who has been involved really my whole adult life in anti-racist activities, both on a professional level and in my different communities I worked in. And I'm also the sister-in-law of Renee Barno, a member of your congregation, who invited me to do this. So I'm going to get started right away. I picked around 6 books, although some I've actually expanded a little because I've paired some that are similar in one way or another. And I'm going to start with a book about the history of racism, which I think will give everybody any background they need to know on the whole topic, which is Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He's been all over the media for his other book that I'm going to talk about, How to Be an Anti-Racist, but he wrote this book several years ago. It was a 2016 National Book Award winner. And when I read it that year, I said to myself, every single American should read this book. Before I read it, I thought I knew the overall and many details of African American history from extensive reading over the years. This book, however, gave me a new perspective. Although it is long, at 514 pages, it is well worth the time and effort for the insights you will gain from reading, or you could listen to it on a tape. Starting from the first enslavers, the Portuguese, at the end of the 15th century, who invented the term race to justify enslaving Africans, we see a complicated history. The way Kendi tells the story is by using 5 historic figures as tour leaders for their particular times. And he highlights the multidimensional sides of these leaders who each had important roles in the history of racism in our country. The first, Cotton Mather, was a very influential preacher who spread racist colonial ideas from Europe. He preached the theory of white superiority. He actually believed that enslaved Africans would turn white if they became Christians. Thomas Jefferson, his second figure, of course, helped to pen our Declaration of Independence, writing that all men are created equal, yet in his personal life, he enslaved more than 600 people, and upon his death, he did not free them, but instead sold them to pay off his debts. Kendi also points out how Jefferson's writings show his many opposing ideas on enslavement. The next figure, William Lloyd Garrison, the outspoken abolitionist, was complicated too, enough so that he alienated Frederick Douglass. Kendi points out that his abolitionist premises were not anti-racist because he said that slavery had turned Black people into brutes. Next, Kendi chooses the Black scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who moved from being an assimilationist, one who tried to fit into white culture, to promoting Black culture and resistance to the status quo as he watched the growth of Jim Crow during his time. The final person profiled, which takes us into current times, is Angela Davis, one of the original promoters of the Black Power movement, who is still actively on the scenes today. Kendi's overall message is that race is a social construct, which he elaborates in How to Be an Anti-Racist, which we'll talk about later. He shows how the concept of racial differences, and in particularly white superiority, was made up in order to justify enslaving people and kept in place because of economic greed. He advocates that in order to end exploitation and disparities, we need to change policies. This is a new and important outlook, and it differs from much of what has been written before. Before reading this book, one might think that if you just got rid of the Ku Klux Klan or racists, there wouldn't be so much racial violence. But no, he argues, it's the racist policies in place that led to the Ku Klux Klan to be able to do what they did. He believes once we change policies, people will just have to follow along. And I believe we can see how this is playing out right now with policies of our criminal justice system coming into question, for example. Kendi is personally working on this through his Anti-Racist and Research Policy Center, which he recently brought to Boston University. I encourage you to listen to him talk online. He's a compelling speaker. I've heard him in Rochester 3 times, and I would go listen to him anywhere. The book ends on a hopeful note, and I'm going to read his last 2 paragraphs. This is the book, by the way. Protesting against racist power and succeeding can never be mistaken for seizing power. Any effective solution to eradicating American racism must involve Americans committed to anti-racist policies, seizing and maintaining power over institutions, neighborhoods, counties, states, nations, the world. It makes no sense to sit back and put the future in the hands of people committed to racist policies, or people who regularly sail with the wind of self-interest toward racism today, toward anti-racism tomorrow. An anti-racist America can only be guaranteed if principled anti-racists are in power. And then anti-racist policies become the law of the land. And then anti-racist ideas become the common sense of the people. And then the anti-racist common sense of the people holds these anti-racist leaders and policies accountable. And that day is sure to come. No power lasts forever. There will come a time when Americans will realize that the only thing wrong with Black people is that they think something is wrong with Black people. There will come a time when racist ideas will no longer obstruct us from seeing the complete and utter abnormality of racial disparities. There will come a time when we will love humanity, when we will gain the courage to fight for an equitable society for our beloved humanity, knowing intelligently that when we fight for humanity, we are fighting for ourselves. There will come a time, maybe, just maybe, that time is now. And I think that was pretty prophetic, because hopefully right now we're moving in this direction. So hopefully reading this book will give you the historic background to motivate you and understand the fullness of this moment. But if you don't think you can read 514 pages or listen to that long, this spring he partnered with Jason Reynolds, a young adult and children's author who's extremely talented. And they did a shorter version, very quick paced. It's called Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. And Dr. Kendi actually asked Jason to write with him. And it's a remix of the longer book, appropriate for ages 12 and up as well as adults. And all the key concepts and stamped from the beginning are put into language and a narrative which will appeal to young people and many adults too. And as the front book flap states, Stamped shines a light on ways you can identify and stamp out racist thoughts, leading to a better future. And I'm just going to read from the first page. By the way, I've taught children's literature, and my way of presenting is I always like to read from books to give a little flavor for them. So I'm going to read passages from many of the books I talk about. So chapter 1, the story of the world's first racist. Before we begin, let's get something straight. This is not a history book. I repeat, this is not a history book, at least not like the ones you're used to reading in school, the ones that feel more like a list of dates. There will be some, with an occasional war here and there, a declaration, definitely got to mention that, a constitution, that too, a court case or two, and of course, the paragraph that's read during Black History Month. Harriet, Rosa, Martin. This isn't that. This isn't a history book, or at least it's not the kind of history, that kind of history book. Instead, what this is a book that contains history, a history directly connected to our lives as we live them right this minute. This is a present book, a book about the here and now, a book that hopefully will help us better understand why we are where we are as Americans, specifically as our identity pertains to race. Uh-oh, the R word, which for many of us still feels rated R, or can be matched only with another R word, run, but don't. Let's all just take a deep breath, inhale, hold it, exhale, and breathe out, R-A-C-E. Okay, now, the next book I'm gonna talk about was just published in the last couple of weeks. It's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. And it was written by Isabel Wilkerson. I had planned to talk about The Warmth of Other Suns, another book about African-American history featuring the Great Migration, which she wrote several years ago. And that book is just a fabulous book of literary nonfiction, telling people's lives like a story. But this book actually has reframed so much for me that I think if there's one book on my whole list right now to read, I would say this one. And it almost makes the others I'm going to talk about after, I don't know, less important in some way, because her ways of stating it is just so astute. So this is a new book, just reached bookshelves. So I wanted to read the book. I just picked it up last week. I wanted to read it before I talked to you today, but it was so powerful. I just had to have it sort of take over this event. So I actually found it breathtaking at many moments. And so much so that I'd have to stop and just take a breath before I could continue reading. So her thesis is that America, from the first enslaved who landed here in 1619, established a caste system based on skin color, and that this caste system has impacted all the racial injustices we have seen in this country from day one until now. Generations of oppression from the system have kept African Americans in their place in a myriad of ways. But it has also impacted every American as well. We can all be compared to actors in a play, acting out our own roles, dictated by this all-encompassing powerful system, which turns human beings into currency. Caste behavior is a response to one's assigned place in the hierarchy, according to the script handed to us, she writes. And the power in her writing comes from her many, many, many specific examples and apt analogies. I'm just going to read one little passage in her description of caste from near the beginning of the book, where she compares it to the foundation of America like an old house. Like other old houses, America has an unseen skeleton, a caste system that is as central to its operation as are the studs and joists that we cannot see in the physical buildings we call home. Caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. It is the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions for maintaining, in our case, a 400-year-old social order. She states that one's place in the caste system is immutable. There was a lot in this book that helped me understand some things that I hadn't understood before. I couldn't really never understand when some of my very obviously upper middle class African-American friends would tell me they were followed in a store or stopped by the police for nothing. But the reason this happens is people are acting out these caste roles. So they're always going to expect a person of dark skin to maybe steal, or it's why a senator can get pushed against his vehicle and handcuffed at a traffic stop, or a doctor mistaken for an orderly. Her own indignities, she describes while she flies first class, are horrifying. She describes how even civil rights laws that were supposed to end indignities just brought more. Swimming pools filled in so darker people wouldn't swim in them. Schools closed so that people of different colors wouldn't have to come in touching distance. And she uses statistics as well. The shocking percentage of African Americans in subservient jobs and poor housing, even when they left the South for a better life. The chapters explain in detail the historic example of caste and how now news media perpetuates these divisions by picturing, for example, more African American criminals, more African Americans in poverty than white people. It gives us distorted viewpoints. She points out the dire health consequences of caste, which we're now seeing playing out in COVID statistics. And she also helped me gain an understanding of what has been happening in this country politically, why Obama was thwarted in so many of his reforms, and why we have had such a backlash resulting in what's happened with the current administration. But reading it with a Jewish lens only adds to the book's impact. So this is a part for some people might be hard depending on their background. But throughout, she compares our system to the Nazis and also to the caste system of India. It is the Nazi comparisons which left me breathless, because in many of the details and well-researched examples, the Nazis often came out better than us. For example, their system was in place for a limited time frame. And when they lost the war, Germany did not put up statues honoring Hitler and other Nazi leaders or fly the Nazi flag on its state houses and in its military, unlike America's adoration of Confederate heroes and flags, which we are just now trying to dismantle, often with very violent reactions. She sees the concentration camps putting people to work for just the amount of food that would sustain them to work, comparable to what happened on plantations for years and years and years. And I know this is a hard concept, but it was shocking, but it seemed very real to me. And one of the things that makes her writing so powerful are the many details she gives with very specific examples from her research. But my Jewish lens also responded to her spiritual framework. Her epilogue and the book as a whole leaves us with a sense of hope that there is something we can do to bring change. Like a prophet, she calls for radical empathy. We can make personal changes that will make a difference. And I'm going to read from her last paragraph. In a world without caste, being male or female, light or dark, immigrant or native born, would have no bearing on what anyone was perceived as being capable of. In a world without caste, we would all be invested in the well-being of others in our species, if only for our own survival, and recognize that we are in need of one another more than we have been led to believe. We would join forces with indigenous people around the world, raising the alarm as fires rage and glaciers melt. We would see that when others suffer, the collective human body is set back from the progression of our species. A world without caste would set everyone free. So I'd say run out and read this book. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about How to Be an Anti-Racist, also by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, which was published last year. In the book, Dr. Kendi states in his introduction that being neutral, for example, people who say they are colorblind or just saying they are not a racist, is not enough. We need a radical reorientation of our consciousness and ongoing movement to change racist policies. Partly memoir, the book is constructed in an unusual way. And I should add to that, not just racist policies, but ourselves. Partly memoir, the book is constructed in an unusual way. It moves between his own development to become an anti-racist and actions he feels we should take. By showing his own personal changes, he gives the book a real power to inspire the reader's transformation. He states that the way to undo racism is to constantly identify it within ourselves and then dismantle it. He believes we're all somewhere on a continuum from racist to anti-racist, and it is always an ongoing process. To make real change, we have to focus on power and change policies and constantly examine ourselves to make sure we are very self-aware and self-critical. And above all, every person should be considered individually and equally valued. One of the things that gives a framework to this book are definitions. He feels definitions are very important to understanding racism. And I'm just going to read a couple of the key ones from the book. We already mentioned that race is a social construct. It was made up to support society's economic system. And his definition of a racist is one who supports a racist policy through their actions or inactions, or through expressing racist ideas. And most importantly, I think, to be an anti-racist, it's not enough to have anti-racist thoughts. You must take actions. And this idea of racist policies comes up again and again in his books. And his definition of that is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups is a racist policy. For example, the written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations that guide us and govern us. Policies that are either promoting racial equity or inequity. Policies are either promoting racial equity or inequity. There's no neutrality. And he prefers the term racial policies rather than the one you might have heard of, structural racism or systemic racism or institutional racism, because he thinks racist policy is a more precise definition and easily understandable. And one last definition, and I mentioned this word before, is the concept of assimilation. And I think this is a concept, I know I didn't always consider it when I needed to, but one that our white privilege sometimes keeps us from considering enough. Just think about our education system, how it's dominated by the white European cultural views. Just by virtue of our education, we whites are taught that our way is the way, and people of color are less unless they assimilate into the mainstream. What is the answer to this? Champion resource equity in our differences rather than trying to mold people into a particular way. Of course, this is a very timely book for now because people of color are speaking out and telling us that we need to change our policies and address the economic and justice system, education, housing, healthcare, and other inequities. And not only are the anti-racism concepts explained well, I think the book is a wonderful motivator for self-reflection. And I'm thrilled to see, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for a while after it came out, and now it's been on since the end of May again. But if you prefer a more informal tone, there's another book that deals with the same concepts. It's So You Want to Talk About Race by Gioma Oluo. And the two of them are about the same age, but Dr. Kendi comes from an academic background, and Ms. Oluo really grew up in poverty, has experienced homelessness at different times, and her book is a more informal and maybe for some people an easier read. She began writing as a blogger from Seattle, and it includes examples from her own life. She talks about some of her obstacles that she worked through to get a college education and make a writing career. And this book is also on a bestseller list. So the perspectives are different, but both books have the same important messages. I personally learned from both of the books. The main message in both is examine yourself, take action. And over her career as a blogger, her goal was to create writing that would be of use. She wants to give people the fundamentals of how race works so they could understand it better and talk about it with more kindness. Her hope is that armed with this knowledge, we can talk about race at our dinner tables and workplaces with greater understanding. Echoing what Kende says, that you can't be an anti-racist without taking action, she compellingly states, systemic racism is a machine that runs whether we pull the levers or not. And by just letting it be, we are responsible for what it produces. We have to actually dismantle the machine if we want to make change. She also writes that by looking at racism as a system, and I might say now the caste system, it becomes much larger and more complicated. But this gives us more opportunity to address the various parts of it. So the book is very practical. The 15 short chapters address things we're familiar with on how affirmative action, police brutality, school to prison pipeline, microaggressions, and more. But I like the way each chapter begins with a practical question. For example, I just got called a racist. What do I do now? And her answers are very clear. I'll give you an example from her last chapter titled, Talking is Great, but what else can I do? Racism may seem overwhelming to you as it often does to me, she writes, but we can each take small steps. Here are her dozen suggestions. Vote local, get in schools, bear witness, speak up in your unions, support people of color business, boycott banks that prey on people of color, give money to organizations working to fight racial oppression and support communities of color, boycott businesses that exploit workers of color, support arts created by people of color, support increase of minimum wage, demand college diversity, vote for diverse government representatives. So many of you may be doing some of these things, or all of them really. And I'm going to end with her note of hope, just like Kendi, with her last paragraph. Excuse me, I'm going to need a drink of water in a minute. All around the country, people are affecting real change with small actions. Change that improves the lives of people of color in their towns and cities and weakens an oppressive system. Racial oppression starts in our homes, our offices, our cities, and our states, and it can end there as well. So start talking, not just problems, but solutions. We can do this together. I just have to take a water break here. Okay. The next book I'm going to talk about is White Fragility. And I was kind of shocked to see Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility rise to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and it has stayed there in recent months. The author has been a diversity and equity trainer for many years. I learned about her when I found some of her training sessions about white privilege online and used them in a racial equity training course that I co-facilitated for the Rochester's YWCA. She's a sociologist who explains all the elements of white privilege in a courageous voice. She tells us compellingly that we must listen to what people of color have to tell us. She points out the many self-defenses we put in place in order to avoid looking at ourselves. If we honestly recognize in ourselves some of the scenarios she describes, perhaps we can be brave enough to become more aware and drop our compensatory ways to avoid taking a hard inventory of our attitudes toward race that we might unknowingly hold just because of our privileged upbringings. White fragility helps us look at our upbringing and the many ways in which this might have caused us to have the particular lens we have for looking at the world. Yeah, she's a sociologist. The book reminded me about my own extremely privileged childhood in the city of Rochester, New York. In my high school, somehow the only students of color ended up in the basement taking manual labor classes. The only person of color I interacted with all the way through high school was our cleaning woman, whose son got to take classes with the other students at my high school because he was so good at basketball. It wasn't until I left for college in the early 60s that I realized how protected I had been from the real world. One of the ideas that struck me most in this book, in her chapter titled Racism and White Supremacy, and I think this point alone makes the book worth reading, is what white supremacy is in America. Now I might say it's the caste system, but until all too recently, I associated white supremacy with neo-Nazis and guys who wore white hooded cloaks. But white supremacy is the whole system we live in, the values, the structures, the caste system. A few years ago, I was part of a core group that worked in Rochester to have a really disgusting racist panel with Pekingese that sat on top of a park carousel on the lake removed. And then we worked to make it, an exhibit around it in one of our museums. But I was asked to be the spokesperson at a press conference. And I agreed to read a statement written by two of my African-American activist colleagues. When I read the statement, I was not entirely comfortable with the words white supremacy being used again and again and again. And I thought to myself, oh, why couldn't they just say structural racism instead? But the words white supremacy, I was afraid would turn some people off. So with all my work and all my efforts, I still didn't get it. White supremacy is the power that we whites wield over people of color. It's been built into our system, as we said before, from day one. This book helped me understand that better. Some other chapters address topics of challenges in talking about racism, how racism has become part of our lives and how white fragility works in action. She ends with, where do we go from here? Her advice is to take the initiative, re-educate ourselves, and figure out for yourself what you can do. But we must be able to listen well, to be able to withstand discomfort and challenge to our own limited perspectives, and get involved in organizations working for racial justice. Quote, interrupting racism takes courage and intentionality. It is a messy, lifelong process, but necessary. If you're here today, I'm sure you're somewhere in this process. So I just want to mention something about this book that's come to light from some people recently. There have been articles about her, and maybe she still has a lot of work to do herself because she charges a lot of money for her training, and her book has been doing extremely well. And she's not giving back to the community that she writes about. And I have pretty strong feelings about that's not a good thing. But I still feel the book has a lot of good points in it, and it's worth reading. And I am counting on her to rectify this. So another book, if you don't want to read that one, that recently was published, really first I think as a workbook, maybe even online, is called Me and White Supremacy, Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor, written by Lila F. Saad. And this is really a workbook. And it's formatted for you to work through it over a month's time with exercises that you can do. And it kind of takes white fragility to the next step with all these exercises, and some of them are very difficult, I would say. I think this is the kind of book, if you wanted to try it, to maybe get together with 2 friends that you really trust and try to work through it together. And so take a look at it and see if you find that you might want to do that. It could be of benefit if you've never done anything like that. And then my final book that I want to talk about is a book that came out this year that's about Native Americans. So I think they've been overlooked in so many ways, their plight in our country. And I think finally now there's beginning to be this convergence of understanding their plight with the same plight as African Americans as the result of colonialism. And I don't know how many of you have tuned into any of Reverend William Barber's online programs from the Poor People's Campaign. But in June, I was happy to hear him talk about his own mixed heritage of Tuscarora and African American, and link the plights of our indigenous people with those of African Americans. The story is really the same. Both have been victimized by colonialism and views of racial inferiority. Both relegated to the bottom heap in our society through the many disparities in treatment and opportunities. But as we've seen in recent protests, there is an enduring strength that continues in spite of 400 years of suppression. So David Truer's 2019, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, Native America from 1890 to the present, demonstrates these many strengths. There have now emerged Native lawyers, successful advocacy groups, businesses, and legislators, as well as schools preserving and teaching Native languages. When I was a grad student, I took a class in Native American history from a Japanese American professor who had been interred on the Navajo reservation during World War II. As you can imagine, he taught this class from a certain point of view. I came to realize, like many Americans, I knew nothing at all of Native history, except what I learned from the Seneca Longhouse and panoramas, which are still in the Rochester Museum and Science Center. This class really opened my eyes, and I began reading everything I could about Native history, and none of it was good. I worked for several years in the urban Native community in Minneapolis, where the disparities were all too evident, and also traveled to reservations for my work. I am so happy to see coming together of the African American and Native communities in Minneapolis after the tragic murder of George Floyd. So David Truer is an Ojibwe, or in their own words for the people, Anishinaabe author, who saw the need for telling what has happened to Native people since the Battle of Wounded Knee. This book is such an important read because he dwells on people's strengths, the strengths of indigenous peoples, rather than the often told stories focusing on their suppression, mismanagement, violence done by our government policies, disease, mass killings, forced reservations, attack on Native religions, starvation, boarding schools, and all the things that decimated their language and culture. And in spite of these horrors, which are true, the people have endured and are even beginning to thrive now in many communities. This history is important, but it's important to know it, but it's still most important to understand that Native people and their many different cultures have not gone away. And I would say we have a lot to learn too, especially from attitudes toward the environment. We now have language immersion schools like the one his brother started in Wisconsin, which is preserving the Anishinaabe language for coming generations. And of course, it is through our language that we maintain our culture. These schools have popped up all over the country. The bleak history is mentioned in context in his book, but the overall tone is positive. Endurance, resilience, these are the themes. Oh, I also wanted to note that he's of mixed ancestry. His father came from, his father was a Holocaust survivor, and his mother is Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. So he has an interesting perspective. So his important message, we are still here. The end of the book, there's a passage that really reminds me of our Jewish commandment to remember that with all the difficulties Native people have gone through, he writes, we can still hear the heartbeat going on, and which for Native peoples, it's the drum, the heartbeat going on. So those are my books, and you will get sent the list of them, and I think now we can take any questions, and Eileen's going to moderate that.
Hi. So we did have a question that was sent in. It says, how do we fight intersectionality? I find it fairly easy to identify racism on the right, but dealing with racism on the left is very difficult.
Wait, could you repeat that? I'm not sure I totally understand. I understand the intersectionality part, and how to be an anti-racist focuses on that a lot. In fact, that's the structure of the whole book. It talks about different groups that come together, but I'm not
sure. Let me
about the right and the left. If somebody else understands that better than me, feel free to join in.
I could always unmute the person that asked it if they want to elaborate. Let me see if I can do that.
Yeah, this is Eric. Thanks for taking the question. What I was trying to get at was really in respect to Jews and the problems that we face on the left as opposed to the right when it comes to working against racism.
Oh, people that are so conservative. And is that what you mean, against those that are more progressive? Is that what you're?
No.
Left, I didn't know what you meant, left side or right side, or different points.
On the political left versus the political right.
I don't really think I could answer that. I don't know if anybody else has an answer. That stumps me as well. The basic idea that Kendi writes about, that we need to consider all groups, all people as people, and nobody's better or worse than the other. So I guess that even if our political views differ, we need to consider every person as a person. I don't know how that answers or helps that answer that question. I think it's very difficult. If anybody else wants to jump in, feel free. You might have a better answer than I did.
Yeah, this is Arnie Gass. I'm off screen because I'm only half dressed. But so I don't want to try to paraphrase what Eric says, but maybe I can give a thought. So the traditional position of the left, if you want to go to the extreme left, the orthodox left, is communism. And the communists were the one group in the 30s and 40s and 50s that supported blacks more than any other group. And the socialists may have been close, I don't know. However, right now, we have obvious racism on the right, such as what happened in Charlottesville, what happens in the Black Lives Matter movement, when a lot of the violence is caused deliberately by people on the right. And yet the left, the anti-Nazi group, are blamed for that sort of thing. But from a person who comes from a liberal perspective like I do, or maybe liberal/radical, although I have only been in the streets a few times, the question is, how do we deal with the notion of achievement, elitism, Western Europeocentrism, and other things like that, which have been the hallmarks of progressive thought ever since the Enlightenment? I don't know, Eric, if that's what you're trying to ask or not. In terms of current politics, certainly most people who are progressive are not racist, I don't think. But the other issue has to do with Israel. And so the question about Israel being a racist country because of its abuse of the Palestinians and the settler movement. So Eric, I don't know if I've covered everything or nothing, but
I was really going toward the latter versus the former.
Right, exactly, yeah.
You know, I think there's a problem, and I'm not sure whose problem it is, but there is a problem when it comes to Israel, and to talk to young American Jews, and most polling that I've seen is that there is a lack of support, or perhaps maybe not that strong, but what's the word I'm looking for? A feeling that we've raised our children to be quote liberals, but when it comes to Israel, we're asking them to put their liberalism aside.
So Nancy, were any of the books that might have had a specific angle or bend on maybe some of this conversation or mentions Israel, these kinds of conversations, I know we'd mentioned in the event description, we're hopeful to come back together as this group after maybe we read a couple of these books. And if these are some of the key topics that are bubbling up, is there one of the books that you could recommend of the 8 that we've discussed that might be a good jumping off point? No,
not. This is too far afield from what these books are dealing with.
Got it.
And
okay.
I think that's a whole nother topic, and I'm anything but an expert on this. And yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's a topic that needs to be addressed, but not by me, and not in these books are really to get you educated on racism in America, and they don't address that at all.
And that's the topic. That's what's being addressed, guys. It's not the way American Jews think about Israel today. The topic is racism in America. It's keep it, we're keeping it within these borders, what we've grown up with, what's happened since, whenever.
That's a topic.
The problem that I see, though, is that yes, we as American Jews are on the forefront, or have been on the forefront, of fighting racism in America. But we get painted with almost being racist, with the label of being racist because of the treatment of Palestinians.
Yeah,
and someone did just come through in the chat, and they said they also feel that there is interconnectedness in terms of white entitlement. Again, what I do want to say is addressing these issues and reading these books and why we came together today, this is all a jumping off point. And I do want people to know that we want to make sure that being an anti-racist is not just, being a Jewish American, but it's also just, being a member of our current society today. I'm seeing some other comments come through the chat and trying to weave in here. I know we have a few minutes left, so I wanted to just open it up if there's any other specific questions about the books that Nancy shared with us. By the way, thank you, Nancy. These are very, very interesting. Some of them are on my Libby list already.
One thing that comes across in many of these writers, and especially in Wilkerson's cast, the passage I read at the end, it's like, we are all human beings. We're part of the human race, and everybody needs to think that everybody has a place here. And if we put down anybody, we're putting down everybody. Or, we all have the Spirit of God within us, if you want to put it in a more religious context. So that's really my the best answer that can come from these books on that topic. But anyway, okay, go ahead.
There's a couple other ticklers coming through the private chat, but none specifically specific. You did say at the top that a lot of these books have been in everyone's purview for a while, but that new cast book was something that you're seeing a lot of potential. So if we as a group were to come together to read something like that, is that something you'd recommend?
Definitely. I think it, first of all, she is really one of the best writers I've ever read, and I'm a constant reader in terms of nonfiction. It's narrative nonfiction, unfolding like a story. She just has vivid, fantastic examples. And but this is a reframing of the whole concept of race. And as I mentioned, after I mentioned that book, it was hard for me to even talk about the others because I think I can see her point of view so strongly.
Thank you. And we have two more questions here. One is, so based upon all of the avid reading that you do, and then, you know, seeing where all these books are kind of giving us some hope for the future, do you feel like, you know, humans can do away with or move beyond hierarchy, power, and discrimination?
What a question. I guess I like to hope so. I mean, I think it's always been in the world. But I like to hope so. I think we have to if we're going to survive as a species.
And another one here. Can you speak a little more on Angela Davis? You'd mentioned her at the top of the lecture.
Yeah, well, she's speaking the past or now, because if I speak about the now, it would get into the Israel thing. Because I actually heard her speak in Rochester, and I felt like leaving because she was so anti-Semitic. But so I don't really know totally what she's doing now. I know she's speaking up for the Palestinians, but you know, in the beginning, she was a spokesperson for Black Power and suffered a lot from her work. But I think now a lot of us would have a hard time with her.
So we have time for just one or two more questions here, and I am seeing some private messaging and Zoom chatting. Cast is rising to the top, and Susan even says, yeah, we'll bring Nancy back when she wants to discuss it. Do you already have a date to discuss that with your other groups?
No, I just read it this weekend. I read it, I got it done, I barreled through it in order to mention it, but then I decided I wanted to talk about it rather than the warmth of other suns. So my other group, I talked about the warmth of other suns, but literally this book, I believe, was just published in the last 2 weeks. So.
Well, yeah, if you do end up discussing it with our group or another group, we can always combine forces and see, you know, about coming together on that maybe in a month or so, give everyone a chance to download it and read it and purchase it. Any closing remarks or anything else you'd like to share with us before we close out today?
I don't think so. I just hope that you'll find some things on this list that will be of personal benefit to you and motivate you to just keep moving down whatever path you're on in this process.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. This was a very fascinating collection of books on racism, and I hope that people do pick those up and check them out and start to educate ourselves. And you will be getting an email with the listings and resources along with a few other links Nancy's pulled together. Again, Nancy, thank you so much. This has been wonderful spending time with you today.
Okay, thank you for inviting me.